generations. And now, the power of two restores the one.
We got a bidet! Hey everybody, and welcome to my channel, Dyad in the Rough. Today I am going to be talking about something that came up with Dave Filoni and when he was asked about an R-rated Star Wars project. So he was asked about this on a podcast, and I am gathering my info of what he said from IndieWire. And it was reported that somebody basically said, what do you think about an R-rated Star Wars project? There's a lot of other cool R-rated projects and some of the other properties that Disney has, such as Marvel, with like the Deadpool movies. And so, could we transition that for Star Wars? And so Dave had said in response, I don't know. I think it looks like they mistyped here. He said, sure. I don't know. I think it's interesting when thinking about the R-rated Star Wars film. And he goes on to say even more. He says, the bottom line is whatever we do, it has to be really well done. I think when you look at something that is taken as different like Andor, it's so well done. And Tony Gilroy, the showrunner of Andor, and his team do such a phenomenal job that I think that there's an audience for that. I think also with that audience, I also, though, want to still be hitting the imagination of the kids out there so that they can grow up and appreciate those things. And then he goes on to add that Star Wars encompasses all types of styles, and the creative of the particular story driving is the most important thing, and they should do something that's within their comfort zone. Otherwise, we're to imagine that everyone's going to come in and pretend they're George Lucas. I've learned from George, but certainly I'm not the same as George when it comes to making movies. He's a one-of-a-kind generational talent. I like wolves and put them in my Star Wars. We're just different, and that's okay, but there are principles that should run through all of Star Wars's about choices and being a good person and being more selfless and getting over your fears that are timeless, no matter what style you're talking about. So, what am I gathering here? It sounds like, a Star Wars R-rated project very well could happen someday. I don't see why not. I do think, though, so there's a couple of things to deconstruct here. One of them is that Dave wants it to still be somewhat relatable for children. Now that's going to be a difficult task to accomplish if we're still trying to get kids watching the show and kind of understanding it. It makes me wonder if when he says kids, if he means like older kids, like teenagers. I don't know. But what I do know is that Star Wars is made for kids. So expanding out into that R-rated region, they would have to make some very interesting choices of what exactly would be pushing the R boundary. I personally don't think we need a project to be R-rated for Star Wars. I mean, we hardly ever see blood, guts. We really don't need swearing in Star Wars. So although there has been a couple of them. Uh, I don't know if we really need an R-rated Star Wars film. I'd be very intrigued to see what it ends up being, but I don't really know what they would do so that they kept those two uh, boxes checked, so to speak, where it's R-rated, but yet kids can somewhat relate to it or follow along and understand it. But the other thing that I want to mention here is he's talking about how, sometimes time passes and then we get to appreciate some of those shows later on. So, for example, for me, growing up, watching the prequels, I was much more of I just wanted to see things exciting on the screen and then, move on to the next movie. Whereas as an adult, I can go back and watch those films and then see, all the cool things that George Lucas was doing with the prequels and making those connections to the original trilogy. So sometimes I feel like some of these projects take some critical thinking, and maybe that's kind of what Dave is getting at here, where like a kid's imagination should be able to grasp it and then maybe appreciate it more later on. Not 100% sure what they're going for there. Um, what I also want to say is, what could I see being an R-rated Star Wars film? Because aside from the bar scene or cantina scene with Ben Kenobi, there really isn't much blood. So if we're trying to get like blood involved for an R-rated film, we'd have to explore like what types of weapons and uh, extent of the choreography and the kills, how would those all translate from, what we know Star Wars to be to becoming R rated? Would that be too drastic? We have to think about the confines of what Star Wars has established. I also think, as far as what could the show be about, I think the easiest one to do would be something with the underworld, with the bounty hunters and stuff and the crime lords. I think that would be a very easy one to dive into and make it R rated. But if we didn't do that, I could see somewhat of like a Game of Thrones approach where like the politicians are kind of going at each other. Instead of taking the throne, like people may be competing for, chancellor or some sort of political power that a lot of people desire. So I think there's a lot of things that we can unpack there. I really don't foresee it being a Jedi driven story unless it's like a gray Jedi. Maybe we could get something with the Sith. That might be a little bit more involved with the potential R rating for the films, but it really is going to boil down to what is the story and what exactly do we need to see in the movie that would qualify it as R rated but still make sense for a good Star Wars story. And I do think that'll be a little bit of a challenge. So if and when they ever do make an R-rated Star Wars project, I'm very curious to see what they use to push those boundaries. But if I were to pick something right now that, is showing potential R-rated ground that they can cover, I would probably say Andor is probably the closest. Not only do I think Andor is probably the most complex of a lot of their projects as of late, but I also think that there are a lot of themes within Andor where we could push that R boundary with the ratings. So I think if we think about the tone and the writing of the Andor show, they could dive even deeper into some of these like evils of the empire and what are they doing to citizens? What are they doing to flex their power? I think that could get into that realm of the R rated. But as far as the other shows, I mean, the Clone Wars, it's a war, but we've already seen that there isn't, blood and guts in the Clone Wars. It's all laser fire, so like it burns the hole right away that was caused by the shot. So uh, we'll just have to wait and see. Those are my thoughts. I think Dave Filoni gave a pretty good answer about like, hey, it's an interesting thought, but we do have to, keep it within the confines of what Star Wars has established, which is interesting to hear that because the Acolyte seems to be very, very different from what we've seen in Star Wars. So if you enjoy this type of video where I give my thoughts on some of these stories, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. drops a like if you like the video, and drops a comment letting us know what your thoughts would be on an R-rated Star Wars project. Where could you see Star Wars kind of pushing these lines to get that R rating? And what would make sense to you? What kind of story would it take? And then, as always, everybody, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.